Welcome to the second edition of the Vinimark webinar series. This episode is titled Women in Wine, Both Journey and Destination. Now, this webinar was initially conceived as being a reflection piece running off the back end of Global Women's Month. But as the conversation developed, we realized that a retrospective piece holds the danger of being exactly that, backwards focused. So it either teeters on becoming 2 hours of inward focused felicitations on any progress made, or it can develop a rather depressing history lesson with no concrete points of action for those wondering to themselves, well, where to from here? Now, as is the case with the other Vinimark broadcasts, our goal is always to be to deliver practical advice. So within that framework, today we want to talk about women as agents of change in the industry. We want to talk about women as workers in the wine industry and women as customers, ideally being served by the wine industry. But before we get into that, I think it's really important for me to say that in my conversations with women working in wine, who I deem to be pioneering, empowered, successful, just downright dominant in their careers, have time and time again asked not to be quoted when I've gone on record as a journalist and said, what is it like to be a woman working in wine? Or they've refused to answer unless I'm willing to say, okay, this is off the record. Or they've spoken freely, and then half an hour later, I'll get a voice note saying, oh, please, look, I know we had a great chat, but please don't publish anything I said to you. And that voice note is almost always qualified with something like, I'm just at a point in my career where I need to keep a low profile. So the reason I mention this is to highlight the caliber of professionals that we have on the panel today, who don't just understand, but they prioritize the importance of honest expression when trying to see about any sort of social progress. So our panel today is a very exciting group of women, some of whom have worked in wine for almost 4 decades, and they have a wealth of experience to share. And then there's others from a completely different generation who they've grown up in a social climate where perhaps gender equality seems less controversial, but it's the fact of any sort of gender distinction whatsoever that's up for debate now. Is it really all a social construct? So during the panel this afternoon, we have Rose Creer, the head winemaker at Stella Kaya Boutique Estate in Stellenbosch. We have Palesa Mapela, who is a marketing specialist, but she's also one of 4 dynamos that make up the Wine-ish team. They're a delightfully disruptive, fun-loving wine blog that seek to educate people on wine, but also to connect people through the power of dialogue. We have Penelope Setti. She's the sommelier at the esteemed Chef's Warehouse restaurant. She's also a platter judge and the brand ambassador for Champagne Bollinger. Then currently in Durban, we have Samantha O'Keefe, is an award-winning winemaker. She's the owner of Lismore Wine Estate. She's also one of only 3 Cape Winemakers Guild members, female members. Then we have international wine entrepreneur Char McCoy. Like Penny, she's a certified sommelier. She's the founder of Char Squared Hospitality and Gastronomy Consultancy. And she was recently named one of the top 40 under 40 tastemakers by Wine Enthusiast. Then we have Cape Wine Master Jeanette Defleurio. She currently serves as the marketing manager for Vinimark and also lectures at the Cape Wine Academy. She's also been a Platters wine contributor. In fact, Jeanette has judged on almost every panel for any wine competition in South Africa. She's been on Veritas, the Old Mutual Trophy Wine Show, the SA Top 100, the Diners Club Wine List Awards, and she's also been on the selection panel for the Nederburg Wine Auction. So just a broad range of experiences there. And finally, we have Jancis Robinson with us, international award-winning journalist. She's a master of wine. She's the author of some of the most important reference works in existence in the wine industry. It was in 1984 that Jancis became the first person outside of the wine industry to pass the Master of Wine exams. And then in 2003, she was awarded an OBE by Her Majesty the Queen. Incidentally, if the UK suffers some bizarre alcohol-related lockdown and the Queen happens to run out of wine, it'll be Jancis's fault because she is the one who advises the royal household on what goes into that cellar in the first place. As for me, my name is Jono Le Feuvre. I am a cisgendered, left-handed, white male journalist. I write about wine and coffee. Jancis even let me write for her website once, and I've pinned that to the top of my CV. And when I'm not doing that, I manage and create content for the HanDrinksSolo wine community. So with introductions aside, I wanted to start with a really wide angle view of the topic. And I want to do that by directing my question to Jancis Robinson. And Jancis, I think part of what makes your input so crucial here today is the fact that you have contact with such a broad range of contexts in wine societies around the world. Obviously, the cultural forces from country to country will render very different outcomes in the fight for gender equality. So, as an outsider looking in over the past 40 years, what have been your observations of South Africa or South African culture in this regard? What are our idiosyncrasies? Are there things that we've done well or particularly badly in our journey towards gender equality?
And it's 45 years, actually, that I've been writing about wine, amazingly. And I have been coming to South Africa for most of that time. On a trivial level, I would say that South Africa is the last country where I've noticed that some men, kind of quite high up in wine companies, seem, maybe this is, and hope this is changing, but it's persisted for far too long, seemed unable to write their own emails. And they used to get, you know, younger women to undertake this demanding task. And then, but then the email address would be a woman, and then it would obviously be, it would have been, the message would have been dictated and then signed by her boss, presumably. And that doesn't give a very good impression of a, you know, an advanced wine producing society to me. But obviously, but less, much less trivially and much more importantly, really, is the overwhelming profile of South Africa as having the widest income gap between the richest and the poorest in the world. I'm told by someone who has studied these things, it also has the highest rate of violence against women, which is not a very comfortable society to live in. And for women, certainly, and it must rub off to a certain extent throughout society. There's the terrible problem of fetal alcohol syndrome, much the worse the country for the incidence of that, which suggests that there's a lack of education there and a lack of real social will to solve that problem. I would, but on a more cheerful note about women, I'm quite involved with an initiative called Room to Read, which I think operates in South Africa as well. And its whole premise is that the world desperately needs more people who can read and write, and with that comes social change. And of course, and they recognize, the people who founded Room to Read, that it's women who teach their children to read. And so they have funded all these projects around the world, libraries, schools, whatever, to educate women, because if you educate women, you then automatically educate the next generation. And I think that's something to bear in mind about the role of women in any society, but particularly in parts of South African society, perhaps that are less developed. Big issues there, but that's what I could think of.
So Jancis, in that regard, have there been countries where you have witnessed, perhaps developing countries, where you have witnessed successful change? I mean, for me, it's about what can we learn from people who have succeeded in making progress. And I'd love to know if you have perhaps examples of something from a place like perhaps Chile or Argentina, where you might have seen progress, where the community has taken on initiatives to bring that about.
In most of my travels, I suppose I'm seeing things through a wine spectrum. And so in countries like South America, where there has been a long-standing sexism, really, it's always really cheering to come across powerful female winemakers who are bossing teams of men around like crazy, and thereby waving a flag for advancement, if you like. When I was listening to your question, I was thinking of the few times that I've actually been in the developing world and seen the work of Room to Read. And I've been involved with them since 2003, and we have fundraising wine galas. It's great. Wine really plays a part in raising money to educate the third world. And ever since they've had time to educate someone who's maybe by about 2010, they already could provide at each of these wine galas around the world one young woman that they had educated, and they always stood up in front of 300 bankers, whose pockets are about to be shaken open, in their national costumes, and given the most brilliant speeches in English, no notes, heartrending stories of how their families didn't want them to get an education, they wanted them to go out to work, or they wanted them to marry them off at the age of 12, all that kind of thing. So those would be very specific examples of advancement. But I know that your major focus is not at the bottom end of the social scale, but is in empowering women much higher up the social scale. Yeah. So I'm sure we'll come into that.
Yeah, we definitely are going to spend more time talking about that, just because it is crucial to the success of any sort of movement. But what I wanted to perhaps ask is zoning in on, from that broad perspective, into your experience over the last 45 years. I mean, you've said elsewhere that you haven't felt like you've had a bad time of things, but do you feel like it has definitely got better? What has been your personal experience of being respected or not respected in the industry?
I feel a bit of a fraud for several reasons. Partly because what I should have said at the beginning is that, of course, everyone else on this panel knows far, far more about South Africa than I do. All I can give you is kind of broad brush outsider impressions, and please take that as read. The other thing is that as a freelance, self-employed writer, I haven't had to consciously fight as many battles as most women in wine. I haven't been selling a product. I haven't had to work my way up a corporate ladder. So all I've done is observe what's happened around me. And I must say that in the last century in the UK wine trade, I was pretty horrified that the women seemed to do all the work, but were never promoted to positions of power and rarely got even the credit. But in this century, I've been very impressed that some of Britain's biggest wine companies have been or are directed by women now. They've got women absolutely in the #1 role, which has, I think, slightly given me a sense of complacency about the role of women in wine in the UK, because I had a real wake-up call, I think it was just earlier this week, a very heartfelt blog written by, well, actually 2 blogs written by women, and all the terrible experiences that they'd had, particularly in the hospitality business, which perhaps Penny can talk a bit about. I've never been in the hospitality business, but I think even in the UK, there is a lot of sexism, there's a lot of bad male behavior, a lot of men in senior positions taking advantage of women working their way up the career ladder. And all of these things are things that I have not had personal experience of, I just hear about. And so I realized that I shouldn't be going around saying everything is absolutely fine in the UK, because I don't think it is in hospitality.
Yes. Thank you, Jancis. Well, Jeanette, if I can direct the next question at you, in that we're still on one side of the counter, you've also had a particularly rich career in a wide range of settings, but not directly in hospitality. So in that respect, do Jancis's observations resonate with you? And what are the areas where we just don't seem to be making any headway?
Very much so. So one thing that was really interesting that Jancis referred to was literacy. And just as an anecdotal link to what I want to say is hearing that made me think of a TED talk that I listened to. The speaker was very passionate about saving the planet and environmentalism. And her argument was that, and it was an Indian woman from India, and her argument was that if we wish to save the planet, we need to educate women. And she meant girls. So, and that's, you know, it may not come automatically to understand how is the education of girls going to save our planet. But it was the ripple effect that we need to ensure that if education is happening from an early level, and empowerment of women, that's the empowerment of mothers, of educators, of, yes, who teaches the child to read, and an awareness. If we build education, we build awareness around the subjects that are challenging all of us on this planet. So for me, that was a very relevant point. Literacy, wine industry or not, this is a worldwide challenge that we have as a people and as women. And linking that for me to the industry that I work in, the wine industry, is how do we see as participants, whether we're in a position of a management position, a leadership position, how do we play a role in ensuring that others are given opportunities and that we are questioning why certain people fulfill certain roles. So I come from a place of privilege. I'm a white South African. I've had a university education, and I've had the luxury of doors open to me because of that. And I'm just reflecting on, I personally haven't had a lot of challenge. Certainly there is a level of the boys' club that nobody really talks about, where when I was living and working in Germany in the wine industry, I represented a very long-term a company that had been around for over 100 years. I had a fantastic position, but I wasn't one of the guys that went out the back and had a smoke together and made deals. And I wasn't a smoker, maybe that was the problem. But there is such a thing as the boys' club, and it exists. And it's no fault of anyone's. It is very much a cultural thing, but it gets forgotten. And it's these little hidden things that we don't question. Who is the cleaning staff in your company? Who makes up the clerical staff? And sure, those people might have made those choices to be in those positions, but what are we doing to challenge ourselves around our perception of what is men's work and what is women's work? How are we making and opening more doors for people in our country, for women, for people of color, to ensure that there are opportunities? How are we changing the way that we think about work and who is fit to do what, so that it isn't automatic for a young girl who has now been able to learn to read, to think, okay, well, these are the kind of jobs that are open to me. And for us as colleagues and members of companies to actually allow that to be the challenge to ourselves, to ask those questions and how we can make change, so that it's not an automatic that if you're a girl and now have been lucky enough to be educated, that you choose from a limited selection of professions because that's what you think you can do. So viticulture is now changing. It's becoming a domain which is both men and women. Winemakers was perhaps a little ahead of that. The heads of wine companies, how much space is that for made available just in the thoughts, the thinking of all of us, really.
It feels like so many of us are limited just by what we see, by the examples that we see laid out. And so it's almost this unspoken thing that for people to break that mold of what is assumed, they almost at a core have to be critical thinkers. So a young woman who sees receptionists are all women may subconsciously just accept that. But I think having conversations like this are quite important in breaking the unconscious acceptance of what you just said. And so I just wondered, as an outsider, is there such a thing as a girls' club that you experience? Is there a growing sense of there is a place where women gather and smoke out the back and make deals? I mean, does that happen?
I don't know if it happens in the same way. I think what I'm referring to is a cultural thing where men and women do, in general, there's different types of behavior. Um, you know, I think if I had to jolly on out with my cigarette and sort of elbow people and pat them on the back and do sports talk, it wouldn't feel natural to me or to them, and it would come across strangely. So it's almost a silly example, but it's a very important one. That what I'm alluding to is that we become more aware to the subconscious thread and the subtext in so much of our interactions, which means that we don't question very much. And for me, when we talk about gender equality and what is male, what is female, and how we embrace our own identity, I would like for us to ask questions. So I was asked a couple of times to judge on a women's only panel, and for me, that I have to ask myself: is that something that is beneficial to women as people? Because we perhaps taste differently, or we represent the women's supermarket shopper. Personally, I prefer to be seen as a person. I prefer to be seen as professional, and that should be the reason why I'm invited to judge on a panel, rather than because of my gender. If I'm going to support women, I think there are some important things to do, but it's not necessarily for me being selected to be on a women's only panel is really making change. Yeah, if that answers your question.
We're definitely going to come back more to that, but I wanted to direct some questions to Cha. I mean, as we said earlier, and in fact, both Jeanette and Jancis referred to this, that they've almost had experiences as outsiders leveling critique. Jancis did it as a journalist or as a tastemaker with an already valued opinion. So Jeanette was on panels. But Cha, you've been working in the hospitality game, and it's an industry with a whole different set of power dynamics. Can you tell me a little bit about what you were feeling or how you were reacting to some of the things that Jeanette and Jancis were saying?
You know, I had to go get a pen because there was a lot of gems being dropped, and I think that it's important to respond. I'm like, oh, this is a big feat. I'm glad I'm earlier in this conversation. But what Jeanette brought up last, I guess I'll work my way backwards. I really feel like one of the main parts of being on the floor, and being at events, working as a sommelier, and I have to use this disclaimer. As a wine consultant, I do anything they tell me to do in wine. They want me to write an article, I write an article. They want me to do social media, I got it. They want me to serve, I serve. So, you know, I like referring to as the wine hustle is really what I do. And so working in the US as well as working in Europe, I have this unique perspective of how gender plays a role on both continents, and even in my small amount of time compared to the two women who spoke earlier with experience. And so going back to Jeanette's last reference, you know, that was the one that struck a chord with me about the girls club response to your question. You know, is there a girls club, but should there be? And I do think that there need to be someone to say something. As a woman of color, I guess we do have our code where we definitely want all Black people to win, right? So I think that when it comes to women, do we all walk into the room and like, you know what, I'm rooting for her. Like, how do I actually speak out, speak up? If I really felt like her wine, if you're judging a wine, was lacking, or is Jeanette actually saying, you know what, let me speak to this winemaker, which she really needed some acid to save that wine. So I really feel like that's when, or how the girls club could actually form, or to be a part of it is like, this lady needs help. Let me be the one to step in and actually see how, you know, it's great wine or got good structure, but it's lacking here. And so she's going to win next year because I think she needs to know this, you know? So I'm just using Jeanette's example as a way where a girls club could be formed in a way where she's using all of her knowledge from tasting for many years to now mentor new up and coming female winemakers. So, and then it also reminded me of a time when I was working at the restaurant right before COVID in Portugal. And we had a section in the wine list that actually identified some of like our favorite female winemakers that was on the list. And so is like, should we have a woman-owned wine list? Like, should that be a thing, or women-made wine identified? But I do feel like if we don't, going back to that receptionist story, would women or little girls know that we do these roles if we did not identify it? So it's this awareness that we're doing by highlighting women in the industry as well. So I do feel like, yes, I want to be evaluated along the boys club and let you know how strong I am in this industry. But there is someone behind me who don't know that I exist. Jancis Robinson, name is everywhere, no matter what country or state I'm in. And so when you look up, especially as someone like myself, when you're thinking of freelancing and not wanting to be on the floor forever, the idea is like, oh, look, what did Jancis do? People, you want a Jancis in your life to know. So knowing her name, knowing what she's done and her contributions for the last 45 years, you're able to see how your life can be able to have some kind of structure and move forward beyond working on the floor. I also dealt with this past week. Someone was assaulted, a female was assaulted during harvest. And in my Instagram, in my DMs, I'm getting a lot of, I don't know if it's people, I guess how you introduce me. People know that I'm very vocal. I will speak out if I hear something is wrong. So my Instagram is becoming like a hotline for sexual and racial injustice. People just sharing screenshots of people trolling them. Usually it's men to women, whether they're in Spain, whether they're in America. And so I do realize that women need a voice, and they really are going to who they think can be the voice for them, the mouthpiece. So it's interesting to be on this panel at a time when I'm literally trying to get one woman from one harvest location to another without stirring the pot. And I really feel like I'm not trying to be a winemaker tomorrow. That's not, so maybe I have to look at it like from an outsider perspective, like Jancis mentioned as well. How do I still be very sensitive to like, why was this woman there? Well, how come she doesn't feel like she can just pack up her stuff and leave? Does she feel like she's going to offend the winemaker and have like a bad reputation for harvest for next year? So I have to like be in her shoes for like 5 seconds to like think, why is she not just running out the door instead of DMing me, what's going on during her harvest? I'm like, you need to call the cops. Like, and at the end of the day, I realized that women really are trying to just make their name for themselves and one day become great. And if they have to endure, unfortunately, there are women who feel like that's just the price of what we do. We're in a boys' world. And so I really do hope that we can change. So our mentality, it comes with self-awareness, it comes with mentorship. And I do want to make sure I say something about literacy, which Jancis spoke about, is that I realized the importance of language learning. I've lived in Italy 10 years ago, and that's where my wine journey began. And I think that it's interesting because, especially as an American, we don't learn language to master it. We learn it to, pass the class, et cetera, not really to become fluent in Spanish or whatever chosen language you. And I think there need to be more dedication to how important learning languages is for us to connect with other cultures, period. We understand other people when we speak their language. There's a lot of assault that happens here because people think, oh, okay, you're Mexican, you should speak English because this is America. So we already have that going on here in the States. But also when we come to France and do harvest, or we go to Portugal, in my case, we should be it allows us to connect with humans, the general interaction. That will allow us to be more open and receptive to learning from them as well. And it lowers the barrier of entry for us. So I just wanted to tack on the part of literacy and then also say that language learning should be something in this industry that we should spend more time on. And hopefully I'll be able to start an initiative with someone with that as well.
I mean, it feels like you started your answer with essentially empathy, talking about walking into a room, seeing someone else and saying, I'm behind her, I want to back her. I mean, that presupposes an attitude of putting yourself in other people's shoes. And again, you seem to end with empathy. And I don't think it can be stated enough that at the core of all the interactions, there needs to be a sense that we all should be trying to understand what other people are experiencing. And I guess you mentioned that as well, asking the questions, why is this woman not calling the cops? You also said something interesting. wanted to help her without stirring the pot. I mean, that in itself is quite an interesting statement. You know, why is trying to get a woman to safety, why is there an element that could be described as stirring the pot? It seems like madness.
In their eyes, you have to take that into consideration.
Absolutely.
I don't mind stirring the pot. That's why someone will call me, right? I'm the New Yorker. They want me to stir the pot. But the thing is that I don't want this to be on, she doesn't want this to be on her record. She doesn't want this to be part of her story. She doesn't want to be the girl that got, assaulted at that winery. And therefore no one will see her as just, the next up and coming winemaker one day. She'll always be known for that one article in the Times or that, so in that case, I have to respect that person's wishes. And so in my case, I don't mind. I'll do whatever, they say, but this is not my story to tell. This is not my experience. I'm just here to be a vessel, to be able to get her to safety and then be able to allow her to still move forward. And I hope, because there's such a generation gap between the women who've already been established in this industry. And I think all the women who's coming up now and we're everywhere, South Africa, America, Europe, Australia, that we don't know who to look to. And sometimes it's usually, Instagram and social media becomes that place, going back to what you're saying about the girls club, of like, who's out there, who's speaking out, and just trying to find people versus the ones who may have been very traditional and always kept it, quite, calm and been able and not telling their story. We don't know the stories that Janice had to go through coming up in this industry 45 years ago. I'm sure, that alone would probably take over the entire conference, but that's not what we know Janice for. And I think that's what we're talking about, stirring the pot. It's when you think of her name, all those accolades you mentioned, we don't know what she had to endure being the only women in all those places. And I actually come from an engineering background. So before even being in hospitality, I'm the only woman and usually only Black person in rooms and speaking on conferences, et cetera, for years. So I think that it's more about what we had to endure to get there. Do you want that to be your story? Or do you want to actually make a name for yourself as the writer, the sommelier, the judge, et cetera? And I think that's where there's this stirring the pot,
Sure.
conversation.
I also just wanted to touch on a little distinction that you made, which I think is quite important. You talked about having a girls' club. Should there be a girls' club, or do we want to be, or do women just want to be respected as a professional? And I think Jeanette kind of teased this out as mutually exclusive. Either you're respected as a professional, or you are, or you need the support of the girls. And Jeanette, I'm sure that isn't actually what you were saying, but I think a lot of people, or a lot of women, live in that unnecessary tension of, if I admit that I need the support of, let's call it a girls' club, then I will not be respected, or I will not be able to have a reputation professionally. Whereas men, the way we operate, we just know that we need the support of our boys' club in order to have professional acclaim. And so I think it was really beautiful the way you put those two next to each other, not in conflict to one another.
Yeah, in Europe especially. In Europe is more, I see that more than anything. Nobody wants to, don't tell anybody, take our name off the women's list. It's interesting. I never thought people would actually ask to be removed. And I saw that more from working the floor in Portugal, and the story of the Queens of Cava that comes from Spain. A lot of that ended up being, that book was put together because it was a man who said, no, people should know that there's women in Spain who are making these wines that the world loves. So, I really think that it's important that we look at, everybody from their perspective as well, instead of trying to change cultures to be more American or more British, et cetera. So.
Amazing. Thank you, Cha. Penny, I'm wondering if I can get you to chime in here as a sommelier who's worked exclusively in a South African context. Your roles may have been similar to Cha's, but in a different country, in a different culture. What would be some of the biggest battles, if any, that you feel you've had to fight? The conversation struck me as enormously upbeat and positive. Are there things beneath the surface that you feel like you're having to overcome?
Oh Lord, yeah. Look, my story's a bit more interesting. Like having moved to South Africa about 20 years ago now, And before then, my father was an artist, so we moved around quite a bit. So I've had the privilege of being in different spaces. So when it came to now working on the floor and in the restaurant industry, maybe I digress a little bit. I'll come back also to, like, everyone's been talking about the education thing. My father was very, very, very keen on us all being educated. It was like the one thing, he was just like, you know, once you get your education, you'll be able to do whatever it is that you want. So, I mean, in that sense, it was like probably doing university, probably wouldn't have thought that I drink wine for a living, but, you know. So, look, in terms of me climbing the ladders, I'm quite a stubborn, bossy person sometimes, as I'm called. So I've never seen something being a barrier for me. So it's just like, you know, like I've wanted to work in wine, and, you know, I started self-taught. Everything was just tasting, because at this point also, when I started, a lot of the sommeliers, especially in South Africa, would predominantly be male. So it was also something for me to try and reach. Would be like, you know what, it just doesn't have to be like sort of black men from Zimbabwe or the white guys from here. And I was just like, I'm so going to rock this. Anyway, I think women, we have a better palate in any case. So, so most of my, where I can see that men try to be sort of opposing would be more the customers that come through. Just, you know, because I walk around quite blasé at work. Like, you wouldn't, unless I told you, like, I don't like wearing my badges or anything like that. So unless I told you that I was like a som, you probably wouldn't even. So, you know, it'll be something like that. Like, I'll get to a table and I'll be like, yes, you know, would you, of course, usually it's the man that's talking on the table. And, you know, I'll ask, I'll be like, would you like me to help you, you know, with the wine list? He's like, yeah, why don't you call the sommelier? I'm like, okay. I was like, that's me. And he's like, oh, did you do this wine list? I'm like, yes. He's like, well, you know, I think maybe you should put a Cabernet Sauvignon. This is men like us like to drink this and this. I was like, sir, if you just probably looked at the wine list properly, you'll find exactly what it is that you're looking for. Let me guide you, you know, that type of thing. So yeah, most of the condescending stuff usually customers, but I've learned to be nice and sarcastic, so I can do it in a very nice way to show them where to get off. But yeah, in terms of also, I think I mentioned this to Jono actually yesterday. I've had a good experience with my backing in terms of my growth in the wine industry. I was lucky enough to be part of the Women in Wine initiative, which is basically, there are about 9 wineries that come together. And what they do is every year they pick a candidate that they then, and I to point out that it's a candidate that has to be a woman of color. So because just trying to get a little bit more of a diversity in the industry, you know, which is not just men, but also predominantly white, you know, and all of that. So I got sponsored by the Radfordale Winery, and the guy, I mean, the giant, I call him my big brother now. He always is, Alex Dale, has been really having my back throughout this whole thing. So I did level 1 and 2, which they're supposed to support you with, but he saw how passionate I was, and he's like, you know what, me as the winery, us, do you want to do level 3? And I said, well, yeah. So he was like, no, we'll support you. And he was like, do you want to do level 4? And I was like, Jesus, you know, like, and he's like, yeah, I have so much faith in you that it's fine. We'll support you for level 4. So here I am currently doing my diploma. And yes, thanks to a man who's behind. So it's not all bad, is what I'm trying to say. But I also do understand that there are real stories out there of people feeling oppressed. But my advice is just like, you know, stay in your lane, look at what you're doing ahead of you. There's no point in you feeling miserable over someone who's trying to stroke their own ego. So yeah, that's what I'd say.
Can I ask you to expand a little bit on that last phrase, stay in your lane? I mean, because I think, look, on anecdotal evidence purely, I'm going, it feels like there are a lot of women around who have had a slightly different experience to you. So
Oh, definitely.
in the sense that it's been more negative. So when you say stay in your lane, how would you apply that to being aware of other people's suffering?
Okay, I mean, when I'm saying stay in your lane, no, that's a very good question. When I'm saying stay in your lane, I'm looking at this more of your path in trying to build your career, because I think sometimes we take off the blinkers and are just, trying to see everything around without actually being like, you know what, my goal right now is not to be like, oh, there's another male sommelier that's going to come and then tell me, I'm not going to use my French words there, but so it's just like, I like to sometimes just put the blinker on when it comes to that, having men trying to tell you things that you should be doing or not doing. I will put a blinker to that, because I'm like, you know what, if I have to listen to every single criticism that I'm not doing properly, like another man is doing, then you're just going to sit there and not actually focus on what the main thing is that you're trying to do, is do the best job that you know that you can do.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know if that answers the question.
No, it totally does. And what you said about a criticism that is telling you that you're not doing something the way other men are doing it. I think that little phrase brings us perfectly to what I wanted to chat to Samantha O'Keefe about, because we were chatting the other day, Samantha, about notions of women mentoring women, and notwithstanding your skepticism over the efficacy of webinars like this one, you said something which I thought really was incredible. You said that in some senses, the idea of trying to be equal to men is a bit of a wild goose chase. And you asked, why try to be equal when the reality is that you have qualities as a woman, or inclinations, or natural ways of seeing the world, you call them superpowers, that give you tangible professional advantages. And your question was, why are we trying to be equal when you can be more than that? Are you able to talk a little more about your thoughts in that area?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly as you said. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, cool. One of the things that I think, in addition to mentoring, that is droned on about in these seminars, is the elephant in the room that's often left behind, is the fact that we as women, in addition to being the best winemaker, the best viticulturalist, the best sommelier, we're expected to do everything at a super premium level. We also are mommy, and we're partners to our partners at home. And we're balancing so many things. It brings us such a perspective on the world, but it also is quite overwhelming. So we're ticking at such a high level all the time. Our senses are more in tune. I don't think there's any question about that. I mean, we could talk about those types of things when it comes to winemaking, but I think it's more, we're ticking we're multitasking in a way that men just don't have to. And going back to the girls club, I also, like Jeanette, am very skeptical and almost opposed to women's only, let's say, contest. But at one point, I wanted to put together a girls club. And we have some of the top winemakers in the world in South Africa that are women. And I thought, I'm going to do a club, and I'm going to show the world how together we are and how we support each other. And we're going to put it on social media everywhere. And you know what? The reality is we all had small children. We don't have time. We don't, men can spend time in smoky rooms, smoking cigarettes and helping each other. We actually do our job, make great wine, sell great wine, go home, make sure the kids have the swimming trunks packed in their backpack, make sure that lunch is ready for tomorrow, make sure everybody's in the bath on time. And as I took down the list of all the women that I wanted in my girls club, I was like, I can't ask her to do that or her to do that. We're all busy, and I think in some ways as women, it's too big of a topic to talk about this balance story, but it's what gets in the way of us just hanging out and having our club and uplifting each other, is that we're trying to just get our job done, get home, help the kids, make sure they're educated, make sure they see a future for themselves. And so I think that's the complicated elephant in the room that we don't spend enough time talking about. How do we support each other and show how we somehow have it all? I asked my assistant, who's a talented, strong, and kick-ass young woman, what do you want to hear from this Vinimark discussion? You know, as a young woman, what are you looking for? What sort of guidance are you looking for as someone who wants to be a winemaker? And she said, I need to understand how I'm going to do this, because I look at all of you and I don't know how you do it, how you have husbands and kids and run your own business and pull this off. And so, you know, I just don't know how I'm going to do it when I get to the point where I have my own children, and how that runs with my ambition. But we do, and we do. And I think women, therefore, are more powerful. We just don't, you know, own it. And so, yeah.
Well, it doesn't come back to what we touched on earlier about just being the example. But you also mentioned when we were chatting that you don't have time not only to set up this club because everyone is so busy, but also, you know, tying into what has been said before about just being aware of one another. You were saying, you know, half the amazing women winemakers that you've discovered, you didn't even know that they were just quietly doing what they were doing. Estates that you didn't know had women winemaker making amazing wine, because hey, they don't have time to jump on a platform and talk about how they are in fact also women and winemakers.
100%. It's exactly what.
Yeah.
It's exactly what I said. I mean, you know, the reality is, not everybody stands up on a stage and holds their hand up. And I think, and I said to you in the last couple of weeks, you know, we in South Africa have taken quite a rap for the lack of diversity, the lack of racial diversity, and the lack of gender diversity. And yet somehow, all of a sudden, I'm learning that there are a lot more head winemakers in our industry that are women that I never knew about. You know, I think there's a handful of women that everybody ticks off when they think, you know, top women winemakers in South Africa. And whose responsibility is that? Is it their responsibility to let us know they're there? You know, it's a complicated one, because we actually do have a lot more women winemakers and wine professionals, I think, than we understand. And I think they just quietly go home and make sure their kids are in the bath, you know, and they make great wine, kick ass for the day, and then go and do the other parts of their life.
So it feels like, again, it's, you know, whose responsibility is it to increase visibility? I guess if society as a whole is practicing empathy, it's not going to be a woman versus the world thing. Jordan Peterson says something amazing, that's what is best for men is what is best for women, because if women are upheld, men will benefit from that process. And it's this thing of understanding that while, yes, women need to stand together, for there to be real impetus, there needs to be a unification at a domestic level, at a social level. I guess what we're trying to figure out.
But sorry to interrupt you, Jono, but I actually think Chad's point really opens my eyes about having a woman winemaker list in a wine list. I must say I probably would have liked I don't know about that. I don't know that I want to be on a woman winemaker list. I want to be on the kick-ass winemakers list, you know. But as far as just being role models, we do have to show that, don't we? I mean, it's not just for the little girls and the women who are reading that wine list. It's for that grumpy old guy who wants a Cabernet Sauvignon that Penny has to deal with. It's you know, letting men know that we make kick-ass wine, not just little girls. And so I think I will be looking at those sections a little bit differently. You know, there's a wine shop in London called Lady and the Vine, and I always thought, you know, do we need a wine shop with just only women winemakers in the wine shop? But I guess yes, you do. You know, and for the men as much as for the women.
Yes. Well, I think not to repeat it too many times, but isn't that, I really love what Charles said earlier about there's two spectrums. There's your professional aspirations, and there's a need for women to have a community of support. And those should not be in violation to one another. They should be allowed, you should be allowed to need both. And
well, I think you made a good point that I think men are quite shameless actually about helping each other, and yet we as women wouldn't openly say that we're promoting other women, we're promoting women that maybe we have a shared background with, where men do it all the time, whatever, you know, minutia club they have. I mean, why don't we just shamelessly support each other?
Yeah, well, I look forward to seeing more of that. So can we take a little left turn here towards the realm of science? Because Samantha, you were saying stuff about, you know, women are just better at this, and other people have said there's definitely women have higher ability there. So I came across a couple of studies. One came out of the University of Rio de Janeiro in 2014. There was one out of the University of California. There was one out of Sao Paulo. And all of these scientific studies were showing that women have up to 50% more neurons firing in their olfactory cortex than men do, right? So put another way, 50% more brain activity in the area of processing smells. Now, when it comes to not just sensing smells, but also recognizing them again, there was again a difference between the two gender groups. So in this experiment, participants went through repeat exposures to a set of aromas. And these experiments showed that after about 6 to 10 repeat exposures, women within a certain age bracket could increase their sensitivity to those odors by factors of between 1,000 and 10,000. Whereas male participants in the study doing the same thing were not able to replicate that or track that increased sensitivity. So I wanted to talk about this a little bit, because I think some of the stuff that you said, Samantha, might be dismissed by folk as, oh, girl power, hocus pocus. But if you take that assertion and you put it next to some scientific studies that are showing that there's a biological, you know, difference in the brain, I think that this is something that needs to be explored more. And I know, Jancis, if I can direct another question to you, I remember it was in roughly 2017, you wrote that you don't see why women would routinely make wine differently to men. And that I think you wrote, you've grown inwardly when people talk about the peculiarities of wines made by women. But in light of these sorts of studies, or in light of what Samantha's been talking about, do you think that there's perhaps space to revisit that sort of idea?
The winemaker, well, Samantha, Sam, you would know more about this than me, but I would have thought how you taste is not the same as how you make wine. Yes, if you and what you've just been spent quite a lot of time saying, Jono, we know that women taste better than men generally. You know, if I had a penny for every man who'd said to me confidentially, you know, actually, if I really want to know how a wine tastes, I ask my wife, you know. Maybe while you're making wine as a woman, you are able to pick up a little bit more subtlety, but making wine, correct me if I'm wrong, Samantha, but it is all about a series of decisions, not all of which are dictated by what you're actually tasting. And so the end product will only be partly dictated by what the female winemaker has sensed along the way. And it will, of course, only be able to be sensed at the consumption point by a woman, won't it? Those little subtle things. You see what I mean? I think the tasting ability and winemaking process are not identical.
So,
can I comment to that?
Please.
Okay. Yes, Jancis, but I also think that, like with anything, winemaking is a series of decisions, and often women move in smaller movements. And so I see with my female winemaker friends, the way that we go through each and every step, we work in smaller movements because we understand that there's a sensory effect with each step, where my male colleagues tend to take bigger jumps, you know, along the way. And, you know, I often very, very stereotypically will say that, you know, well, for men, you know, power is the first indicator of quality, you know, and for a woman, elegance is often, on first glance, an indicator of quality. But as far as how your touch affects the final sensory process, we are smelling and tasting at every step of the way. And I work very closely with women winemakers and with male winemakers. And I just see that men kind of take bigger steps, if that makes sense. I mean, there is certainly a difference in the way that women approach the process versus the way that men approach the process.
That's very interesting. Thank you. I will feed that in.
Samantha, are there young male winemakers who come to you seeking advice, and are there young male winemakers that you are mentoring at all?
Absolutely, yeah. I work with a number of young men. Sure.
It's great to hear. It would just be a shame to have that insight and expertise only being shared with young women.
I think anybody who has worked with me, a young man, will certainly come out of it with a different appreciation than the experience he has in a different vintage working with a man, for sure. Yeah.
Thank you. Palesa, can I bring you into the conversation? We were chatting the other day, and essentially in this last section, we were talking about whether there are physical differences between men and women, perhaps the kind of decisions they make because of their nature, because of their brain makeup potentially. And I think what Sam was touching on here is a little bit about the nurture and how that can also define feminine winemaking. But you made the other point that side of nurture also comes into play after the wine has been made. You're saying, well, okay, the wine's been made now, but how is that product communicated? And I mean, as a Black woman who's passionate about wine, who's passionate about dialogue, and even about human connection, what do you think are some of the big things that need to change about how wine is marketed and communicated, specifically in South Africa?
So I think when I speak for myself, or as for my collective, as Black women, the main thing that I would say is I want products marketed to me uniquely as a Black woman as well. And in many ways, that's a bit of a bridge that we try to gap that we try to bridge as well. I think we occupy a unique, creative, and somewhat disruptive space in the industry where we are quite resolute on we want to reach people who look like us, who have similar experiences to us. And I think there is a huge gap for how you reach those people. What language are you using? How are you sort of characterizing and defining wines? How are you making sure that the way that you define wines and tasting notes and so on is in a way that also reaches this kind of audience, reaches me. So I may not have reference of, what hay tastes or smells like, because perhaps I didn't grow up in a certain place, or maybe I've never had a green apple. And so I can't really quite pick that up. But I still love wine, and I still want the product to be marketed directly to me. And, if I can sort of stretch this, I think I'd say there seems to also be an awareness of the necessity of the kind of role that we play and other marketers like us, digital marketers, influencers, that kind of space. There seems to be quite a lot of awareness of the necessity for that, but not quite, the investment isn't quite all the way there in saying, we understand you are the people that can reach this kind of audience. You are the people that can help us popularize certain aspects of wine, that can make it relatable, that can debunk this very daunting industry. Everyone's on the same page about that, but there seems to be a gap when it comes to then sort of walking the road with people like us, or really how can I say, investing in the concept that I think we all are aware of, that the world just does not move without Black creativity at this point in time. And this is something that you and I spoke about, Jono, the other night. And those aren't my words, this is not my concept, but it's something that rings true to me and to the group so much. And I think you only need to look around to see that. If you look at pop culture and we look at, you know, how so many brands can benefit off of Black culture, and then more so Black womanhood. That's the only example you really need to see to you know, get the point that this kind of energy, this kind of creativity is really what most industries, most products can use. And I find that instead of partnering with these kinds of minds, this kind of energy, you know, collaborating and so on, there's so much of just stealing concepts, you know, strange things that really don't have to be so. So I think from a marketing perspective, there's a huge sort of, I call it a come to Jesus moment of just realizing what it is that you, who it is that you need to walk the journey with you to reach certain people who are, you know, probably 80% of who's consuming your product.
Do you feel like there are brands who are getting this particularly right, or examples perhaps you can think of that where we can say, okay, that's, yeah, can you give us an example of that?
I do think there are brands that are getting this right, but I will say that it is pretty much only because of the peer pressure that online space allows. So a lot of consumers prefer to receive information from, you know, key influential people. And so they'll really back those individuals, they'll really push for their cause to a point where a brand does sort of threaten that individual's intellectual property or their creativity. It is often the audience that comes to the defense. So I think that's also another case in point of how impactful, you know, people that occupy this space actually are. So there are brands, I think, even in the South African context, that have gotten it right, even after they've sort of recognized that they got it wrong. And if I can mention a brand that we are so big on at the moment, just for this particular kind of example, it is Savannah Cider. So I'm not sure if anyone is aware, but a few months ago, they sort of took an idea that was popularized by a very influential young Black South African. And they took it and they literally ran with it in their marketing strategy. I mean, like national strategy. And it was impossible for anyone who is just remotely online to not, you know, connect the dots of where that idea came from. And so, I mean, I think Savannah Cider in that instance had two options. One option, which I think is what, you know, most of corporate South Africa would do, and that is to just completely blindly move on, you know, issue a small apology, send some products and move on with their marketing campaign. Or the option that they did go with, that very few are getting right, which was to say, hey, publicly, we completely got this wrong for whatever the reason was. We would like to acknowledge this idea, this brilliant idea that was good enough for us to want to market it at national level. And we'd like for you to be on board at a national level, you know, as the collaborator and as the creative sort of director of this concept. And so they've been running for what seems like a couple of months now, a campaign that's doing exceptionally well with the person that the original idea was, you know, originally taken from. So there are, you know, a couple of very few, you know, instances where that happens so well and in such good taste. But the rest of the time, it's quite disappointing when you look at the resources that big corps have. When you look at just even their, you know, CSI initiatives and their values, which will always say things like collaboration and diversity and transformation. Often that's like just written in fine print, but never really carried through in the actual ethics of the company.
Can I add something,
I mean, it
Jono?
seems
Sorry.
like, Chad, you want to?
Chad.
Yes,
I think that it she brings up a good point that actually relates to what Jeanette mentioned earlier, and that's about equity. And so at the end of the day, when it comes down to it, who's the cleaner? Who's, you know, and no one's questioning how come the cleaner is always a female, and what Jeanette was speaking about, or a woman of color, which I'm sure that's certain in South Africa, as well as in Portugal when you come into the restaurants. And so no one's questioning, how do we get that Black young lady out of that role? You know, how do we get them to become an owner one day or working on the campaign one day? That's a psyche that, of course, I have no idea how we're ever going to change it, but that's the much larger issue at hand. And that's, to the examples that she just laid out clearly, it shows that the change is not, you know, it's not going to happen overnight. We have long ways to go. Like a lot of brands, big and small, willing to make the mistake, you know, let's just say if they're daring enough to at least make the mistake, they're willing to make a change. That's great. Then we know we have something to work with. The ones who walk away, which is the majority of them, I don't care what country you in, which is normally going to happen, and they're not going to actually, one, they may not apologize, and if they do, are they going to actually bring someone on board to be part of the equity of the brand, you know, whether it's on an ownership level, the campaign level, et cetera? Are they willing to really have us part of it? Women of color, et cetera. So how do we get people to look at us in that way, not just giving us handouts like free wine?
Yeah.
Palesa, you were talking about how you were sometimes annoyed with the assumption that you would get paid in wine. You're saying it's like this weird extension of the DORP system. And maybe it's also a little bit about what you seem to be teasing out is the difference between a rather cynical capitalist way of saying, oh, we need to tap into that market, which is a different attitude that says we need to embrace that market.
Yeah. And I mean, I think the odd tension, you know, between these two things for me is that if someone approaches you to say, we absolutely love what you're doing, we absolutely need a piece of that pie, it's then strange to me that the next logical step to take is, oh, well, we can't pay or invest, but we absolutely love it and we absolutely need this, so we'll just give you some wine, you know? I just can't rationalize that. And I think with how, you know, the world has evolved, the need for certain specialized skills has also evolved. So at this point in the game, at this point in anyone's game, I don't think there's any industry, like at all, that doesn't prioritize or is trying to prioritize the role of marketing and that kind of strategy in their business. It's just impossible to do well without it. So understanding this as a specialized area, as a specialized skill, and then, you know, seeing the fit response to be, I don't know, a case of wine, which is beautiful always. It just seems a bit, I mean, I'm not even sure what the word is at this point in time.
Well, I suppose people always want to appear authentic, but they can't do that unless they actually are authentic. You can't appear authentic. Do you know what I mean? It's like
That's right.
And I think that's what you're talking about, is that thing of, well, let's have that voice, but we don't want that voice to necessarily be part of us.
Right.
So I feel like there is more to be said here, but I just wanted to progress a little bit to bring in Rose Creer for a while, the winemaker from Stella Kaya estate. Up until now, we've been talking a lot about the struggles of a career in wine for women, right? But in the run-up to this event, I spoke to Rose Creer, who is a world-famous viticulturalist, and she commented to me that unless one can address the plight of the women under the highest levels of oppression, then all of our conversations are kind of we're building a house of cards, really. And in her mind, the group of people in the highest states of social emergency are often the unemployed. They are often single parent women, often mistreated, and they're the vineyard workers and the farmhands. And Jancis, you mentioned this early on, just talking about the awful disparity between the rich and poor. Now, Rose, you actually grew up in the town of Pniel, and that's just outside Stellenbosch. And there, that is full of communities and families that do depend entirely on the wine industry for their livelihood. And when I was reading your story and your incredible determination, I loved the story because for the most part, at least from the outside, it seems like it has quite a happy ending, right? You're getting to work in a job that you love, but when you look at the sorts of people that Rose Creer was mentioning, do you feel like there has been any progress made in the protection and upliftment of our female vineyard workers?
So it's always interesting when I hear people in the industry loosely or casually throw around the phrase, wine is made in the vineyard, and exactly how much time and effort goes into the production of top quality wines. What I feel we often don't really fully understand is that like we don't understand just how much time and effort really goes into achieving this high level of standard. And I mean, I've worked with similar women in the vineyard myself, and to see how fastidious they are in their work ethic and how remarkable they really are. I mean, these women they are breaking their backs literally. They are so undervalued, and to many they are just invisible. So to answer your question, I don't think we're doing nearly as much as what we should do. I mean, there are some organizations that are investing in uplifting their employees by affording them the opportunity to buy into the company by means of shares and being involved throughout the entire value chain process. Or some even offer day and aftercare services to children of these workers. There are also some that offer regular health screenings because this is unfortunately a luxury most of them can't afford, or it's a luxury to most of them. So I think that we have definitely seen some change, but I think women on the wine side are given a lot more opportunity than those on the vineyard side. And I mean, we've seen it with the wine mentoring programs. We've seen it where females are given the opportunity to start, manage, and own their own brand. Where opportunities where women are holding managing positions. So yeah, like I said, we've definitely seen some change. It took a long time, but change has begun, and I'm sure if we remain focused on empowering these women, we will get to where we need to be.
When people are talking about corporate strategies and building businesses and creating profit, they often talk about creating a culture, and that culture at the core is what will help this business succeed. Do you feel like you are in a position to craft and shape the culture within your business? Do you feel that when you're at Stella Kai, you can change the conditions, even if it's just through the attitudes of employment? Or was that something that feels far off?
Sorry?
Is that something that feels too far off?
No, I think it's definitely, well, I'm always one of those people that once I've set my mind to something, I definitely want, or I make sure that I achieve it. So I don't think it's that far-fetched. I mean, we impact people's lives every single day. Like, we do these small things that we think are very insignificant, but to some it actually makes a difference. So yeah, I think definitely we do make change, or we change people's attitudes, and yeah, as we go along our path.
Because I guess the hope is, right, that all the young Rose Kriers out in the world today who are dreaming of a position of winemaker, they're going to have an easier path. But it feels like there's a lack of hope in seeing those changes come about. And it feels like if we aren't in positions where we can create a circle of influence around us that changes the atmosphere, then it's almost we can't even get off the ground. Are you aware of programs currently in operation, or even developing programs that are enabling education and literacy for vineyard workers and farmhands?
So I think more and more people or young women of today's generation, they're choosing not to be homemakers anymore, or not anymore, but they're choosing to not just be homemakers. I would like to believe that the empowering of women have still instilled this new confidence in the younger generation, a generation that is stronger and much more determined, a generation that chooses to be whatever they want to be, a generation that does not necessarily do what their parents once set out to do, where the parents were farm workers and then the children now choose to be farm workers as well. So yeah, it's that sort of thing. But something that has always stuck with me, and I'm sure always will, is something my parents growing up always taught us, and that is that if you don't limit yourself, the world could be your oyster. And I think there are many such life lessons like ingrained in the minds of many of these young women. And I mean, if you couple that with some great role models, the sky's really the limit. So I do believe that we'll see more people venture into this industry. I feel that in a really competitive environment, the onus is on us women not to it's on us to uplift and support each other. We shouldn't take this or make another competition out of this. We should realize that it's okay to compliment other people and to, because I mean, surely one's success inspires another. As to will they have it easier, I think there's a lot of different programs and internships that will definitely help make the transition a bit more manageable. But I think, like with most things in life, if nothing worth having is easily obtained. So if you really want it, you'll do whatever it takes to ensure that you do what needs to be done in order for you to get to where you need to be. So it all depends on what you make of it.
Thank you, Rose. Was there someone who wanted to add something? There, no. So we're coming into sort of the last section of the webinar, and I wanted to actually pose a question to the entire panel. So we may have to do the hand raising thing to anyone who wants to share. But I think we often view the problem of animosity between the genders or oppression of women as, or at least I think I'm guilty of viewing it as being out there. But it's not out there, it's in here. And it's in our marriages or our romantic relationships. It's around the family dinner table. So my question to the panel is, what is the one concept that you wish your male family members or your friends or your significant others could just understand a little more completely, that would enable them to not watch this journey of the upliftment of women from the sidelines, but to be able to be on the quest with them? What do men need to understand better in order to join the journey towards equal opportunities? Is this a tricky one?
I can add. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Penny.
No, all good. I think what I'd like people to understand is that Samantha touched on that very well. Like, it's not, especially if you have a family, it's not just the one thing that you're doing. We work bloody hard with, in whichever sector of the wine industry that we're in. So generally, I mean, I make jokes about it, but generally, people just think, oh, I'm just sitting there and I'm like, oh, swirling a glass of wine and just sipping on it. But, it's not, you don't understand like all the hours behind the studying that has to be done. Like, I mean, this diploma literally is making me age a couple of years at the moment. But yeah, so I've gotten that also like from my brother and just certain males where they're just like, oh, but you know what? Yeah, we the more traditional sommeliers, because, I'll bring out a Quatre tea or whatever like that. But the way that I work at work is just, as women, we're more empathetic. So, you know, you're able to read people a little bit more, like, just in terms of, you know, if you walk in and you tell me what you like, sometimes I ask questions about, oh, do you like, you know, your coffee black or with milk in it? Already that just tells you what someone wants. But, you know, at the end of it, we just seen that, especially as sommeliers, you know, we just seen that we just swirling around wine and just sort of drinking it. So that's what I would just like to say. It's like, yeah, just to understand that we bloody work hard.
Samantha?
I think as much as it is for us to tell men what it is we want them to understand about us, I think the one thing that all women need to understand is that we are the ones who raise the men. And as an outsider coming into South Africa, there were behaviors and attitudes and cultural patterns in South Africa that I was so shocked as a California girl coming into this culture as an outsider. And all I could think of even then, I wasn't a mother, is women raised these men. You know, women are the ones who taught these men how to be how they are with women. And so we need to take ownership of it as mothers, as much as co-workers, as colleagues, as students, you know, learning alongside them. We raise the men in our lives to look at women and treat women the way they will go out into the world and treat. We do need to understand that we're powerful, that we're intelligent, that we can do not only as much as they can do, but actually more, because we have a bigger list of things to do. But most importantly, when you become mothers, young women out there, you are the ones who are raising the next generation of men. And it's your responsibility to be to them and to model for them the way that they should treat all the other women and see all the other women. I know my sons probably are going to be fearful of a lot of women in the world.
That's amazing. Wow. Chad, it felt like you wanted to add to that?
Yes, I was just saying that, or thinking the same thing I think about when you talk about race. Everyone plays a role. There's no back seat in how do we get women there. It's not only for women or the girls club to do this job. Everyone plays a role. And so it was nice to hear about Jenny sharing Penny talking about her brother. I have a brother as well. I think it's very important that even in Samantha's case, when you ask the question, do men come and work under you? They play a role. They go into the industry and say, I loved working with Samantha. That's important, because then people will change their perception. No matter, it's not always about the man on top. It's about that's pulling the strings or owning the companies that we work for or our clients. Sometimes it's the people that's our peers. Sometimes the people that's underneath us. Sometimes it's our family members, the husband stepping in so you can study longer, the brother champion you on, you know, to be that support system for you, your moral support, your colleague that may be your peer to, you know, help you, you know, level up in a way. And so I think that if people recognize that, or if men recognize that they all play a role, you know, it's not just, I'm not in the wine industry, I don't see how I can help. There is definitely a role you can still play in the part of the same way we talked about women winemakers. If a man came into into a restaurant and said, you know, which one of your wines is made by female, I'll be, if it ever happened, it's never happened to me. Maybe Penny, one day you'll get lucky and find someone so bold to be able to do that, because I feel like I do in America actually have more people speaking that way. When I work at wine shops, same thing. Where's the women-made wines in the store? Can you identify them? So we starred them accordingly in the different shelves with a little red star, so people don't have to access anymore. They can go straight to the red stars. So I feel like the more that other areas, you know, and I think that's different for New York, if people realize with their dollars and their money, they also are buying into helping women actually be uplifted in this industry, then we all see that we play a part somehow in some way. So that's my message to all the men listening, is that, you know, just kind of figure out what part you can play to help us all elevate.
Thank you, Cho. We do have a question from the audience.
Yes.
Joanna Locke asks, do we think that, do the female achievers on the panel feel that positive discrimination, I assume affirmative action, is necessary or desirable in order to progress the cause of women? Yes, Jancis. Anareth, can we just unmute Jancis? Sorry.
Here's an idea, referring back to comments earlier about, you know, if every receptionist you see is female, then that's going to direct women thinking that they should be receptionists, sort of thing. Maybe there should be some sort of positive discrimination and, you know, get a few men into these traditional female roles and, you know, just generally level the playing field rather than just give the women a leg up. There's an idea.
Fantastic. Yes, Jeanette?
I think just to add on to that, because it's really about critical thinking and questioning. And so you brought out, Jono, one of the points that I value in women is empathy. And not that men aren't empaths and can't be empathic and don't have empathy, but certainly what are some of the qualities that we value in working as a group of people very often is the sensitivity that some women will bring to another person's situation. And again, it's not solely women, but certainly. But what I also want to see, and it's a challenge to women as well as to men, is the questioners, the people who question, to ask, to speak up, who aren't afraid to say the uncomfortable things. And a number of women today have said that they're not afraid. So it was Penny, it was Cha, it was Samantha. I think every single woman on this panel isn't afraid to open their mouth and speak out. Otherwise we wouldn't be here. I see myself personally as one of those people who create discomfort because I'm not afraid to say the thing that's not always wanted, people don't always want to hear. And I would really call on women to play that role, to ask the questions, to be more critical, and on men when they feel that what is this all about, and or particularly in the Me Too campaign when things got really uncomfortable for certain men, or the exasperation was there, or the too much feeling was there, to question themselves as to what role they might have played. And as much as I hear you, Samantha, about raising our children, because I'm a mother too, and I too come home to that, and I think many of the women on the panel have done that, our men shape our men too. Our women shape our men, and our men shape our men. So there's an equal responsibility here to ensure that we are, both genders are empathic, that we are considering not only how women support women, but how men support women, how people support each other.
Samantha, felt like you wanted to add into that.
Yeah, just
Well, sorry, I think you've cut off a little bit.
on the question of affirmative action, I'm of a generation where I grew up in America, where affirmative action was a policy that was put in place pretty much through my lifetime. And I think that the economy is better for it, that the culture is better for it, that companies are better for it. You know, when companies have been forced to put women and people of color on their boards, they generally, even if they were reluctant to begin with, find that they have, you know, more creativity, a bigger worldview. I don't see any problem at all with affirmative action policies to add diversity to any position. But to Jancis's point, I have to tell you, I was sitting in traffic in central Durban today, and I looked over and there was a nail salon in downtown Durban, and all of the manicurists were young men. And all these ladies were sitting there having their nails done, and it was hysterical. And it was also hysterical how odd it looked. And I said, now there was somebody who had a training brainwave, you know, a bunch of young men that had nothing to do. And so they're sitting there doing acrylic nails for all the ladies in central Durban. Fabulous.
So before we do wrap up, are there any perhaps parting comments that anyone from the panel would like to make? Okay, well, I personally have felt superbly enriched. I hope that, if you at home found today useful, then the great news is that the conversations don't end here. I mean, I hope the conversations will continue to ripple out into eternity, but more practically, Vinimark has launched a series of podcasts and opinion pieces, and they can all be found on the Vinimark website underneath the news tab. So go and make sure you see those. And finally, I just want to thank Rose and Palesa and Penny, Samantha, Char, Jeanette, and Jancis. I know that you are all supremely busy. And so thank you for giving of your time, for giving of your thoughts, for being willing to speak. Your input has been invaluable, and I'm just so appreciative of your courage. So thank you to you all. And I hope you all have a good evening, or Char morning for you.